Welcome to the Critical Accounting Podcast with me, Dr. James Brackley. In this video, we're going to look at what next for Birmingham City Council. We saw previously how in 2023, Birmingham City Council issued a devastating bankruptcy notice and how this bankruptcy led to the largest ever cuts programme any local authority had ever seen, as well as the largest ever asset sales programme of any local authority. The frontline service cuts alone amounted to £300 million over 2 years, and that was the 24-25 financial year and the 25-26 financial year, making £150 million of cuts in each of those years. And remember, these were cuts that devastated adult social care, children's services, the closure of libraries and community centres and youth centres and so on. In this video, we'll take more of a forward look. We'll look at the 2026 annual accounts that have just been released in the past few days. We'll look at the 2026-27 budget for the coming financial year, and we'll finish with a few reflections on what are the lessons for the new coalition administration that's just taken charge in Birmingham. Starting with the 2026 accounts, these of course build on some of what we knew previously. And starting with their top line income generation, we see through to 2023, I've mapped this out over the last 7 years in fact, and we can see that their income through to 2023 was somewhat flat, and they had two really difficult financial years in 2022 and 2023. In many senses, 2023 was something of a perfect storm for Birmingham. Many councils saw a very difficult funding settlement in that year. We can see an actual cash decrease in their top line revenue, and this happened at the time that we had a cost of living crisis, steep rises in the cost of delivering crucial services, increased demand at the front line as well. And of course, in the Birmingham case, this came alongside the disastrous launch of a new IT system in April 2022. So as well as having a very difficult funding settlement, as well as having a cost of living crisis that was driving up frontline costs, Birmingham City Council was spending hundreds of millions of pounds on this new IT system. The latest estimates suggest they have now spent £170 million on an IT system that was originally budgeted to cost only £19 million. But also they were unable to effectively collect council tax and business rate income in that first year after launch, and they were unable to effectively track their budgetary savings as well. So we had this devastating situation in 2023, and then through 2024 to 2026 we start to see an increase in the top line revenue of the council. So this is quite interesting, and it reflects something of a lag in the national funding. So nationally, the government put additional money into local government following the cost of living crisis and particularly the high profile crisis in adult social care. But they also implement something called the Fair Funding Review. And this Fair Funding Review was designed to reverse some of the effects of the previous decade of austerity that had disproportionately impacted on more deprived inner city areas like Birmingham. Effectively, councils like Birmingham had lost out more than other wealthier authorities through austerity. So we had this combination in 25 and 26 of a more generous funding settlement nationally and some redistribution towards councils like Birmingham. You can see, looking further back at the history of Birmingham's funding situation from 2010 to 2021, Birmingham lost actually around 40% of their spending power. And this was driven by big cuts to their central government block grant. If we place that alongside other councils in that same decade, again using the National Audit Office data, we see that Birmingham is one of the most severely affected councils in that decade up to 2021, with only a handful of London boroughs seeing deeper cuts. So again, to recap, we'd had a decade of the deepest cuts of almost any authority. We then had the disastrous launch of a new Oracle IT system on the back of another difficult funding settlement in 2022 and 2023. This is then followed by the more generous funding settlements in 2024 through to 2026, which we can see nationally on this chart according to a recent parliamentary briefing paper. So all else being equal, if we hadn't had that disastrous Oracle IT system launch and the bankruptcy notice, you would probably see a situation in Birmingham where cuts would have had to have been made in 2022 and 2023, but then some of that funding would then have come in the subsequent years. So they could have perhaps drawn down to some extent on reserves in those years and then looked to balance the books in the following years through the more generous funding settlement. Now, in reality, these more generous funding settlements in recent years have only barely kept up pace with the steep rising costs of services in many councils. So under the normal course of things, we would, of course, have still seen likely some cuts and some drawdowns on reserves in those years, but the situation was made exponentially worse in Birmingham by the failed launch of the new Oracle system. So all of which leaves the council in a declining reserves position through to 2023. We then saw in the previous video how the council then balanced their budget and in fact made substantial surpluses through to 2025 through the use of asset sales. This now takes us through to the financial position in 2026, the most recent set of financial accounts that we've just had published. But let me take you back to the autumn of 2024 when they were planning the budget for this most recent financial year. In that year, the government made their first Fair Funding Review settlement, initially a one-off settlement for 25-26, and that then fed into the medium-term 3-year Fair Funding Review settlements from 26-27 onwards. And in that budgetary settlement for that 25-26 financial year, Birmingham City Council got around 37 million of additional social care grants, a new recovery grant of 39 million, additional children's services funding of 11 million, and 18 million of additional homelessness grants. Now, the 37 million there was already budgeted for. That was a part of a previous settlement, but the recovery grants, children's services grants, and the homelessness grant amounted to £68 million of new funding in the autumn of 2024 that Birmingham had not previously budgeted for. So this affected the second year of that 2-year cuts agenda. So we just had that first £150 million of cuts. We saw that the council therefore balanced their budget, and the asset sales then generated that large surplus in reserves. We're now on to the second year of that cuts agenda, and we see Birmingham getting this much more generous funding settlement. And so you might think, fantastic, we've planned to make £150 million of cuts. That's on the back of £150 million of cuts we've already made, the deepest cuts any local authority has ever made in a single year. So surely this additional funding can be used to protect services. We've heard from council executives that some of these cuts could cost lives in children's services, and we've got an additional £11 million coming in there specifically to protect children's services. So you might think, okay, we can reduce the cuts down to maybe 80 or 90 million. But that is not what happens. The commissioners insist that their original top-down targets of £150 million in each of those 2 years remains. And this additional money that's coming in from national government is effectively used to close a small residual gap that they were planning to run in this second year, together with running another surplus budget. So this is extraordinary. You've got a situation where nationally a Labour government is giving Birmingham tens of millions of pounds of additional money, specific ring-fenced money to protect vital services. And then you've got a Labour administration locally backing the commissioner's call to not use that money to protect frontline services and instead use that money to top up the council's reserves, which, as we've already seen, are in quite a healthy position. So all of this feeds through into the 2026 accounts, which we've just recently had published. And as you can see there, the general fund increases once again to almost £1 billion, or well over £900 million that we now have in the general fund. And this is the fund, remember, that we were told in 2023 was in the red, to the tune of nearly £700 million. Another remarkable thing from the publication of the latest set of accounts, I introduced you last time to the reserves onion, and I said that this chart showed you the innermost 3 layers of that onion: the usable reserves, the general fund, and their earmarked and unearmarked reserves. Well, in the latest sets of accounts, they've completely abolished that innermost layer of the onion. They no longer even track that earmarked and unearmarked reserves category within the general fund, and we now just have the total general fund disclosed in the accounts. So that limits us a little bit in terms of tracking those core available reserves that the council has immediately available for use. But just looking at the general fund in total over those 2 most recent financial years, we can see we have surpluses there in both years, 25 and 26. In 2025, as we saw in the previous video, we had almost £200 million of asset sales being brought in to top up that general fund, and that generated, in the latest set of accounts, we've revised the figure slightly. We've revised the surplus in the general fund up to 186 million. I think we said it was around 175 million in the previous video. In 2026, we see another surplus on the general fund, this time of around 40 million. And again, we can see a smaller transfer of asset sales into the general fund on this occasion. And this is interesting. This tells us a couple of things, because we know that the total asset sales were more than 300 million over these 2 years from disclosures from the council. So straight away, it tells you that not all of those asset sales are actually even being brought in to the general fund to make those funds available to the council to spend. But also we can see that those asset sales that are being brought into the general fund are almost exclusively being used to drive big surpluses in the general fund. We saw last time how the £200 million asset sales drove that surplus in 25. Again, in 2026, we've got a smaller £25 million of asset sales being brought in, and that's boosting a nearly £40 million surplus on that general fund. And once again, if you look at the general fund, if you look at what's being set aside within there, you can see the vast majority of this is being set aside in discretionary, contingency and slush fund reserves. Some of it is topping up various ring-fenced reserves as well, but all of that money is available to use and is not being spent. Interestingly, this is almost certainly a breach of the government's capitalisation direction. So the authorisation Birmingham got to sell those assets in the first place said very explicitly that an authority may only capitalise expenditure when it's incurred, i.e. they cannot use that money to top up reserves. They can only use those asset sales to cover real in-year expenditure. And as we've seen, that is not the case. In the latest 2026 accounts, we also get an update on the council's equal pay position. So let's look briefly at how they account for equal pay, because there've been all kinds of misleading claims that the equal pay liability might be 760 million, it might be £1 billion. Well, in the accounts, usefully, we now get a definition that is used to account for equal pay. And it's something called the IAS 37 definition. So let me just talk you through a few crucial elements of this. I mean, first of all, it has to be the council's best estimate. It's not a worst case estimate in the accounts. They also have to have a present legal obligation as a result of a past event. So they can't account for hypothetical future liabilities. It has to be a present liability based on existing discrepancies in the workforce that have already taken place historically. It also has to be able to make a reliable estimate, and that point 3 is why the vast majority of local authorities with similar equal pay exposures to Birmingham don't typically set aside these whacking great provisions in their accounts, because until the amount is settled, you've got no reliable estimate. Birmingham is an outlier in the sense that we're almost the only council that put a hypothetical equal pay liability into the public domain prior to any settlement being reached. And the actual numbers in the accounts on equal pay are also quite interesting. We get the following. In blue are the historical equal pay liabilities that we had disclosed up to 2022. So in blue, they were the accounting liabilities that were in the public domain at the time of the bankruptcy, if you like. Then last year, we got 3 sets of accounts published, and we also got a revision to the 2022 accounts as well. And last year, we saw that a £404 million equal pay liability had been dumped into those 4 sets of accounts, 22, 23, 24, and 25. And now, interestingly, in none of those years were there actually any equal pay payments or settlements. It was just a hypothetical liability sitting there in the accounts to cover some possible future exposure. Now, in 2026, the situation changes a little bit. We start to see some actual equal pay settlements being made, and that reduces the liability down to what we currently have in the accounts of around 330 million. So never at any point on an accounting basis do we have anything like the 700 plus million pound liability that was suggested by the previous Labour leader of Birmingham City Council, the commissioners and executives and so on. The accounting basis, the number that the council has put in their own accounts, has never exceeded this 404 million figure. It's also perhaps worth pointing out that this isn't really how you're supposed to account for a liability like equal pay on an accounting basis. Under normal circumstances, a liability like an equal pay liability is a liability that accrues over time with exposure. You saw under that definition, it has to be a present obligation from a past event. Therefore, you should see that liability building up as you become increasingly exposed to these equal pay discrepancies in your workforce. And now under equal pay legislation, you can only backdate those claims to a maximum of 6 years. So if we assume that that liability is correct in March 2025 and we start to see settlements being made in 2026, then you should actually have seen that liability accruing through 2022, 23, 24 and 25. And you should have also seen, if that was a long-term future liability, the council should have also been discounting that liability to a present value figure in their accounts. So if you just quickly assume that that liability accrues over time and you discount it by CPI inflation, for instance, you get the following, which is what I think they should have had in their accounts in 22, 23 and 24. And particularly interesting there is that in March 2022, that original liability in blue is probably quite close to what the actual liability on a present value basis would have been at that point in time. So we see a number of interesting things there from the annual accounts. They're an incredibly detailed document. There's a great amount more in there that we could go through. They're also very complicated in terms of their presentation. There's some interesting disclosures around the council debt position that we've not had the chance to go into in this video. But if I just move on to a more forward view on the 26-27 budget, we see several things in their most recent budgetary papers. Again, we're going to see another top-line revenue increase next year of around £180 million or so. The council disclosed when they released their budget papers that there was going to be a big reinvestment in services. Now, the press release on this was somewhat misleading. When you actually go to their latest budget papers and look at what investments in services they're making, the figure comes to around about £39 million. And around 9 million of that, again, going to be a theme in a lot of these videos, isn't real expenditure, it's setting money aside in reserves. But if we look at some of the real investments within that £39 million figure, we can see £1 million going back into youth services, £1 million going back into library services, £2 million going back into street cleanup and environmental health. So you can see a number of investments directly in services that were previously cut in that £300 million 2-year initial cuts agenda that the Commission has made. So this is incredibly bad financial planning. It's incredibly expensive to make people redundant, to close libraries, to close youth centres, and then in the third year of your financial intervention to try and rehire people, to try and reopen some of these services. It's a desperately inefficient way to plan service delivery. And again, it just comes back to that point that the Audit Reform Lab and others made back in 2024, that the commissioners really needed to try to balance the books over 3 or 4 years, not over the 2-year cuts agenda that they implemented. This is not an investments budget though. However, despite the headlines that were published by the council, there are also a whole series of new cuts in the latest budget for 26-27 amounting to £94 million. Again, if you go through that on a line by line basis, we're seeing yet more cuts to Birmingham's Children's Trust, to adult social care again, and to a range of other vital frontline services in the council. At the same time, we're also seeing the council top up various contingency reserves, and this is not including PFI or joint venture risks. There's big provisions in the accounts for those as well, but £29 million topping up contingency reserves and the general fund balancing reserve. So effectively discretionary reserves that they didn't have to set the money aside for. So essentially it's another surplus budget in 26-27. And again, when you look at the strength of the council's reserves, some of the strongest reserves of any peer council, and you look at how they've topped up reserves in recent years, to make £94 million of cuts while also setting aside nearly £30 million in reserves seems a very strange approach to their financial planning, given the depth of cuts that we've already made in Birmingham. And lastly, we also see in the latest 2026 budget some clarity over the council's pension provision. There's been a lot of speculation over this in recent years because the council's pension scheme was revalued. We know there's a big surplus in the West Midlands local government pension scheme, and council officers have previously denied this would have any significant impact. It was suggested previously that the reduction in employer pension contributions would be around £14 million, not likely to be that material. Well, in this latest budget, we see that there was actually a £47.1 million drop in employer contributions directly as a result of the latest pension revaluation. So again, that's £47 million of cuts the council may not have had to have previously made if it had balanced the books over just one more year. So taking the reserves position that we saw previously, we're expecting another surplus budget of circa 29 or 30 million pounds. You'd anticipate, all else being equal, another small surplus in the general fund through to 2027. And just to reiterate once again, this would leave Birmingham with one of the strongest reserves position of any comparable council, and that's according to the council's own peer analysis. So we've seen some of the headlines from the 2026 accounts and the 26-27 budget. Myself and colleagues from the University of Birmingham have also done various interviews and data collection and observations, and we can just run through some of the key lessons that we might take away from all of this for the new coalition administration. So, reflecting on the Birmingham case, it becomes highly apparent that there are enormous information asymmetries. So council elected members struggling to process the information that they're given or not being given all of the information. And that makes it exceedingly difficult for the regulatory and scrutiny committees to do their jobs. We've also seen instances where the commissioners have blocked scrutiny, where the cabinet and previous administration has felt under pressure to simply do what they're told by the commissioners because they're under an intervention. So this seriously erodes the governance and democracy of Birmingham when those normal democratic layers of the council simply can't do their job, either because they don't have the expertise, they don't have the information, or they feel under pressure to make certain decisions. Related to that, a lot of people have reported to us how they feel overworked as councillors and underskilled. We need to look at the training that is made available to councillors in councils like Birmingham that are under intervention. And we need to think seriously about how realistic it is to ask a city of over 1 million people to be represented by only 100 councillors. Of those 100 councillors, the previous administration, you had about 60 in the leading group. Under the new coalition, we have only around 50 councillors or even less as part of that coalition leadership. So how realistic is it to ask less than 50 councillors to oversee all of the democratic functions of the council, of such a big council, also keeping on top of their local casework, in a situation where they're not always being given the correct information and in which commissioners are able to effectively overrule them or withhold information? And related to this is one of the conflicts we saw was around what do we actually mean by good governance. There's been a lot of talk that we need to improve the governance of Birmingham City Council, but we find that people have very different ideas of what that actually means. Is good governance asking difficult questions, holding executive officers to account through the regulatory committees of the council, like audit committee? Or is it the opposite of that? Is it letting officers get on with running the council, taking the politics out of scrutiny, letting the commissioners and the experts run the council, and while the politicians take a step back? And those two things are not compatible with one another. We have a democratic model in which we elect councillors to hold executives to account through the regulatory and scrutiny layers of the council. If good governance means those elected members should not ask difficult questions, should not ask things to be put in public session, should not try to get to the bottom of some of the difficult issues, then we have a lack or a vacuum of accountability. We saw the central issue with the launch of the Oracle IT system was one in which executives of the council launched that system and then for more than a year failed to disclose the major failures in that system to the governance layers of the council. So in our view, good governance means there needs to be more scrutiny, more accountability, not less, as has been suggested by the commissioners and the external auditors and others. There's also, related to that, significant uncertainty over who elected councillors can take advice from. Again, does good governance just mean those elected officers take advice from the officers or from the auditors perhaps, or should they take advice from more widely people who are experts in local government accounting and financial information? Then turning to the intervention itself, we've seen many examples of how top-down targets were imposed in very early stages of the intervention, and this overrid any possibility of doing meaningful impact assessments or value for money assessments. In short, we had many instances of cuts that were being made that were likely to create new costs for the council, new pressures on frontline services. You know, when you cut those crucial preventative services that people rely on, you push people into crisis point, and this can drive up your statutory frontline costs. For instance, temporary accommodation is a classic example. When families reach crisis point, they become homeless, and then the council has to spend tens of millions of pounds on bed and breakfast accommodation to keep children and young families from being homeless. The cuts to neighbourhood advisory services, some of the cuts to public health, some of the cuts to wellbeing, youth services are also examples of this. And where local campaign groups and charities have challenged some of these value for money decisions, we see a kind of a short-termism in the council's financial planning, a lack of transparency over who the actual decision makers are, and a lack of leadership, certainly from the previous administration, when it came to challenging the commissioners and making the case for positive intervention and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve in our statutory services. And finally, in a lot of our evidence, we also saw how there's a huge focus on the politics of personality. We had a very high-profile lead commissioner who left the council last summer, and oftentimes actors and stakeholders seem to take account more of the personalities, who's saying what, where they're coming from, and maybe less on, well, what does the underlying evidence actually tell us? So hopefully everything I've covered in this video is something you as a critical observer can verify for yourself. You can come to the same conclusions or different conclusions. All the links are in the description below to the latest accounts, to the latest budget, and other key documents of the council. And that would probably be my key piece of closing advice for the new coalition administration. Take advice as broadly as you possibly can, but take that advice critically. Come to your own conclusions, verify the facts, familiarise yourself with the council's budget and accounts, look at that reserves position and how we're topping up those reserves year on year and how we're setting money aside in reserve while also making tens of millions of pounds of cuts. And when you review that budget for next year, for 27-28 in the autumn of this year, and when you're looking at those line-by-line savings items, and I don't doubt that there are going to be some more difficult savings being proposed, don't just assume that that total savings target is a given. Also, dig through those budgetary documents very carefully to look at how much are we also setting aside in reserves. Are we drawing down on reserves? What's the plan, not just for next year, but for the year after and the year after, for 3 to 5 years into the future? And think about the outcomes that you're impacting when you make service level cuts. Because when you cut a service, you can create new costs for the council. You can damage the outcomes that you're trying to deliver for your local residents. There's a famous quote from the ragged-trousered philanthropist that goes along the lines of, the working classes can seldom afford to buy good things. They have to buy cheap rubbish, which is dear at any price. And we often find the same thing with council finances. If you cut to make short-term to hit budgetary targets, you often undermine longer-term financial outcomes. Perhaps with reference to the council's complete defunding of the arts, which we saw under the Commissioner's intervention, we could also cite another famous quote of Oscar Wilde, that the commissioners seem to know the cost of everything, but the value of nothing. There is an intense focus on annually balancing the books in local government, a near obsessive focus that is driven by a national austerity framework, a framework of accounting and audit and reporting that heavily biases towards short-term savings delivery over and above long-term outcomes. But with recent real terms funding increases set to continue for the next few years to come at least, we are now finally in a position where we have the security over our income and we have the reserves position to justify a genuine medium-term 3 to 5 year view in which we invest in the city, we invest in the future of our residents, and we try to achieve those better outcomes. And that will in turn have both financial and non-financial positive impacts for the council. So thank you very much for watching this video. Please get in touch if you have any questions about this analysis or anything else you'd like to discuss with myself or my colleagues, either at the University of Birmingham or the Audit Reform Lab or anyone else. Thank you very much.